Moscow, Idaho, a small, seemingly peaceful town nestled in the rolling hills of the Palouse region. A place where everyone knows each other, where the streets are quiet and the night air feels safe. At least it used to. On the night of November 13th, 2022, that peace was shattered. Four students from the University of Idaho, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, would never wake up. Their lives, cut short in a brutal, shocking act, would mark the beginning of one of the most perplexing and haunting investigations the town had ever seen. It started like any other night, or so it seemed, but the next morning something was wrong. Kaylee's car, usually parked at the corner of the street, was still there, untouched. Her phone, left behind on the kitchen counter. The door to their shared house was ajar, but the house was silent. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the sounds of a typical college evening, all gone. Inside the house, the scene was disturbingly calm. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, at least not at first glance. There were no visible wounds or blood splattered around, no indication of a fight breaking out, no shouts heard from the street. Yet the quiet was deafening. The four students, all from different parts of the country, had spent the evening together. Kaylee and Madison, the closest of friends, had gone out to a local bar, a regular spot for college students looking to unwind. Zana and Ethan, who were in a relationship, stayed back at the house, likely winding down from their own day. No one expected anything out of the ordinary. There was no fight, no argument, no warning signs. But then came the grim discovery. At 3:00 a.m., the first of the bodies was found. A passerby who had heard nothing but the typical rustling of the night stumbled upon a horrifying scene. One by one, the authorities arrived. What they found inside was unimaginable. The bodies of Zana and Ethan were found on the second floor of the house, in a bedroom lying in bed, as if they had been asleep. Kaylee and Madison's bodies were discovered upstairs in a similar state. Both girls were found in the same condition. Stab wounds to their bodies, but no struggle, no defensive wounds. It was as if they had been asleep when the attack happened. The coroner's office would later confirm that the victims had died from multiple stab wounds, a violent and brutal end to what should have been a normal college night. The weapon, later determined to be a large fixed-blade knife, was not found at the scene, further complicating the investigation. There were no signs of a robbery. Their belongings, phones, wallets, and personal items were untouched. The police were left with a puzzling question. Who could do such a thing, and why? The town of Moscow was left in shock. In places like this, where everyone is connected, where the biggest concern is finals or football games, murder doesn't happen. Murders like this tear apart a community, leaving everyone questioning their safety, their neighbors, and their own understanding of the world. The authorities, initially clueless as to who could have committed such a crime, turned to the most logical place to start: their last moments, their interactions, their friends. The first course of action: questioning those who knew the victims. But as investigators began speaking to family, friends, and neighbors, they were confronted with an unsettling realization. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary. There were no red flags. No one had heard a scream. The house, usually full of the sounds of college life, was silent that night. There was nothing, just a quiet, terrifying nothing. And then came the first break in the case. Surveillance footage from a nearby camera showed a dark-colored sedan leaving the area around 4:00 a.m., just minutes after the time the coroner's office determined the murders had occurred. The vehicle, though blurry, was identifiable. But there was something unsettling about it, something too clean about the way the events had unfolded. The investigation was gaining traction, but at the same time, it was leading down a path that was growing darker and more mysterious with every new clue. The data aligned too perfectly. The evidence, though consistent, felt almost too clean, too deliberate. Sometimes that's when things start to go wrong. Investigators could feel it. Something was missing. There was a gap in the story, and it wasn't going to be easy to fill. The truth seemed to be just out of reach, hiding behind the shadows of the town's quiet streets. The investigation would soon uncover more than just the identity of the killer. It would expose the chilling reality of how one person's actions could destroy an entire community. In the days following the discovery of the bodies, Moscow, Idaho, was in a state of shock. The town was still processing the horrific event, but the investigation was already underway. With the scene being sealed off, law enforcement officers, detectives, and forensic experts started to comb through every inch of the house, looking for any trace that could lead them to the killer. The silence that once filled the small community now felt suffocating. No one could comprehend what had happened, and with each passing hour, the pressure mounted. The first priority was to understand how the perpetrator had entered the house. There was no forced entry. The front door was unlocked, which suggested that the killer may have known the victims, or at least gained access without suspicion. However, the lack of any physical struggle or disturbance inside the house created a chilling sense of calm. The victims were not fighting for their lives. They were taken by surprise, killed swiftly in their sleep. At this point in the investigation, the physical evidence gathered at the scene was minimal, but it was enough to begin forming a theory. The crime scene was carefully documented by forensic teams. There were no signs of a struggle, and the bodies were found lying in their respective beds, suggesting that the victims were unaware of the threat until it was too late. There were stab wounds, precise and deep, on the bodies of all four victims. The knife used was determined to be a fixed-blade weapon, though it was not found at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed that the victims had died from blunt force trauma and multiple stab wounds, with the time of death estimated to be between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. This was crucial information, as it meant the killer had been in the house during the night, likely after everyone else had gone to bed. However, there was something troubling about the timeline. It was almost too precise. Could the killer have been tracking the victim's movements that night? As investigators began to pore over the evidence, one element stood out: the lack of noise. The neighbors reported hearing nothing out of the ordinary. There was no sound of yelling or commotion, no dogs barking, just the quiet hum of a late autumn night. It seemed as though the house was deliberately targeted to ensure minimal disturbance. The question lingered: how did the killer manage to avoid detection so completely? A key piece of evidence came from a local business's security camera, which had captured the image of a vehicle leaving the area at approximately 4 a.m., around the time the coroner estimated the murders occurred. The footage was grainy, but the make and model of the vehicle were clear enough to narrow down a search. However, investigators were stumped by one detail: the vehicle left with no apparent hurry, no signs of urgency. It was as if the driver had no fear of being caught. In a case like this, where no obvious leads emerge immediately, digital forensics become essential. Investigators began analyzing the victims' phones, searching for any clues that might indicate the killer's identity. What they discovered was nothing short of unsettling. Kaylee Goncalves' phone had a series of strange, brief calls at various times of the night, the last of which was made at approximately 2:30 a.m. The call had not been answered, but the timing was critical. It placed her phone in the vicinity of the murder scene just before the time of death. But there were more questions than answers. Why were these calls made? Was she trying to reach someone? The unanswered questions piled up. Why hadn't the victims fought back? Had they known the person who attacked them? Or was this a completely random act? Theories emerged, but no conclusive answers were forthcoming. Further examination of the digital evidence revealed that a few of the victims, particularly Kaylee and Madison, had made several social media posts just hours before the murders, a few innocuous photos at the bar, a text here and there. Nothing that screamed danger, nothing that hinted at the threat lurking so close. As investigators began to piece together the fragments of the night, they realized the unsettling truth: the killer had been watching them. Whoever had carried out this act knew their movements, their schedule. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. It was planned. Every detail, the time, the manner in which they were attacked, the way the killer had moved through the house, suggested a level of premeditation that was deeply unsettling. In towns like Moscow, murders don't just tear apart families. They destroy the fabric of the entire community, and the weight of that destruction was beginning to show. Friends, family, and neighbors were struggling to comprehend what had happened, to grasp the reality of a killer being so close, hiding in plain sight. The community's sense of safety shattered. The investigation was far from over, but as the forensic team continued to analyze the evidence, a clear pattern began to emerge. The killer had been careful, too careful. There were no signs of anger or passion at the scene, just precision, coldness, and an eerie calm that suggested a mind working through a plan. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was calculated. With the early evidence now pointing to a methodical and deliberate attack, the case started to shift toward a deeper, more unsettling possibility. This wasn't a random crime. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The killer had been watching. And now the search for the killer would need to go beyond the physical evidence. The investigation would have to explore the digital footprint, the hidden corners of social media, the places where the killer might have been lurking in the shadows. In the aftermath of the initial investigation, the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho, continued to be rocked by the horror that had unfolded within the walls of one of its homes. As days passed, law enforcement officers and forensic teams dug deeper into the evidence, looking for anything that could help identify the person behind the brutal killings of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Yet each discovery brought more questions than answers. The first step in any murder investigation is to understand how the killer entered the scene. And in this case, that question led to a particularly unnerving realization. The killer had gained access without a trace of force. No broken windows, no forced entry, nothing. The door had been unlocked, leaving investigators to wonder if the victims had known their attacker or if the killer had found a way to enter without suspicion. With no signs of struggle, the forensic team began to analyze the bodies, looking for any physical clues that could point them in the right direction. The coroner's report confirmed what they had suspected. The victims had been stabbed multiple times, but there were no defensive wounds, no signs of a fight. This indicated that the killer had approached them with a level of control, striking swiftly and efficiently. The lack of struggle meant one thing: either the victims were taken by surprise, or the killer had established a sense of trust that allowed him to get close. But there was another disturbing aspect of the crime scene: the blood. It was clear that there had been a significant amount of bloodshed, yet there were no signs of the killer panicking, no indication of a hasty departure. Everything seemed too calculated. The murder had been carried out with disturbing precision, and forensics confirmed that the weapon used was a large, fixed-blade knife, a weapon that had not been found at the scene. The absence of the knife raised even more unsettling questions. Did the killer take it with him, or had it been disposed of elsewhere? As the forensic team continued to piece together the evidence, they turned their attention to the digital traces left behind by the victims. Their phones, which had been left behind at the scene, provided some initial insights into their final moments. The most telling clue came from the phone records of Kaylee Goncalves, who had made a series of calls just before the murders occurred. The last call, placed around 2:30 a.m., was unanswered. The timing was critical. This suggested that Kaylee, or possibly someone else, had been in communication with the killer shortly before the murders took place. In addition to the phone records, the investigators turned to the growing field of digital forensics. The victim's social media activity was analyzed to find any potential connections to the killer. Kaylee and Madison had posted a few pictures earlier in the evening, sharing moments from their night out. But the images were harmless, the kind of posts that would be expected from college students unwinding after a long week. There was nothing about the posts that suggested danger, yet the digital trail was starting to build a clearer picture. The breakthrough came when investigators focused on the surveillance footage from the local area. A grainy image showed a dark-colored sedan leaving the area at around 4 a.m., within the time frame of the murders. The footage, while not of high quality, was enough to identify the vehicle as possibly being a Hyundai Elantra. The vehicle's departure was not hurried. It left with an eerie calmness, which only deepened the mystery. Was the driver in a hurry, or did they feel no sense of urgency because they thought they wouldn't be caught? Forensic experts were quick to analyze the footage, cross-referencing it with traffic patterns in the area. It was revealed that a vehicle matching the description had been spotted near the house during the same time frame. However, this didn't immediately link the vehicle to the killer. The sedan could have belonged to anyone. Still, it was the only lead that seemed promising, even if it was just a small thread in a much larger web. At this stage, the investigation seemed to be caught in a limbo. The physical evidence was clear. There had been multiple stab wounds, and the victims had been attacked in their sleep. The knife was gone, and there was no sign of forced entry. The lack of defensive wounds led investigators to believe the killer had been methodical, possibly known to the victims, or someone who had gained their trust. However, it wasn't just the physical evidence that puzzled the authorities. It was the sense of control the killer had over the situation. The murders had not been chaotic. There were no signs of desperation or panic. The crime had been carried out with chilling precision, leaving investigators to wonder whether the killer had planned this attack for weeks, months, or even longer. What made this case even more difficult to unravel was the lack of any real suspects. There were no obvious motives, no stolen valuables, no signs of personal grudges, no known enemies. The victims, by all accounts, had been well-liked, with no indication that they had crossed paths with anyone dangerous. They were just regular college students leading normal lives. And yet they had been targeted, executed in cold blood, in the comfort of their own home. The pressure was mounting. With every passing day, the investigators were more and more convinced that the killer had been watching the victims. They had been picked, targeted, and killed with a level of awareness and control that was hard to ignore. The idea that this was a random act seemed increasingly unlikely. For the first time, investigators began to consider the possibility that the killer was someone from outside the immediate circle of the victims' lives. Someone who had been watching from the shadows, gathering information about their routines, their habits, and their vulnerabilities. The idea that this was a crime of opportunity seemed less plausible as the evidence continued to paint a picture of a calculated attack. Days had passed since the horrific discovery, and the investigation into the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin had progressed. The authorities had combed through the crime scene, examined the digital evidence, and conducted initial interviews with those who knew the victims. Still, the killer remained elusive. With no obvious suspects and few leads, the case began to feel like a puzzle with missing pieces. The forensic team, however, remained focused. Their work was meticulous, their attention to detail unwavering. One critical aspect of the investigation was the surveillance footage from a nearby camera. It had shown a dark-colored sedan leaving the area at around 4 a.m., just after the time of death. The vehicle, though blurry, had provided the first clue that there might be a way to track the killer. The investigators immediately began to analyze the vehicle. The make and model of the sedan were now identified as a Hyundai Elantra. They cross-referenced the footage with traffic records and found that the vehicle had been in the area during the critical window. It was a potential lead, but it was still too vague to draw any solid conclusions. The car's departure from the scene had been unnervingly calm. There was no sign of panic, no indication that the driver was in any rush. But it was what happened next that would send the investigation into an entirely new direction. Investigators ran the license plate number of the Hyundai Elantra through local traffic records and found a match. Brian Kohberger, a doctoral student in criminal justice at Washington State University, located just a few miles from the University of Idaho. Kohberger had been under the radar until that point. A background check revealed no prior criminal record, no indication that he had ever been involved in any violence or criminal activity. But there was something unsettling about his profile. He was studying criminal justice, a field that, on the surface, made him seem like an unlikely suspect. Yet the very nature of the investigation suggested a deeper connection between him and the crime, something that had been carefully planned and executed. Kohberger's vehicle, the Hyundai Elantra, had been in the area on the night of the murders. This was more than just a coincidence. The timing, the location, it all seemed to point in his direction, but the most crucial evidence had yet to be uncovered. Investigators began to dig deeper into Kohberger's digital footprint. They wanted to know if he had any connections to the victims, if there were any clues that might explain why he would target them. The search for this evidence led to an unsettling discovery. Kohberger had, on several occasions, interacted with the victims on social media. It wasn't clear how deep the interactions went, but the fact that he had been aware of their activities raised alarms. The timing of his contact with them, paired with the evidence that he had been in the area around the time of the murders, made him the most likely suspect. The more the investigators dug into Kohberger's life, the more disturbing the connections became. It was clear that he had been tracking the victims in some way, monitoring their movements, and possibly even planning the attack for weeks, if not months. But what was his motive? Was it simply an obsession with these particular students, or was there something more sinister at play? The breakthrough came when investigators matched DNA found at the crime scene with samples taken from Koberger. The DNA evidence tied him to the murders in an irrefutable way. With this discovery, the case took a dramatic turn. Koberger was arrested and charged with the murders of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan. At first, Koberger denied any involvement in the killings, but as the evidence mounted, it became clear that he had been the perpetrator. The calculated nature of the crime, the meticulous planning, and the chilling lack of remorse pointed to a person who had thought through every step of his actions. Koberger's cold demeanor during his arrest only added to the sense of unease surrounding the case. It was as if he knew exactly what he had done, and yet he was unfazed. The investigation revealed more than just a killer. It exposed a man who had been living in the shadows, watching his victims, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Koberger's deep understanding of criminal behavior, gained through his studies in criminal justice, had allowed him to execute the murders with a precision that was both chilling and methodical. It was clear that he had been planning this crime for a long time. He had learned everything he needed to know about his victims, about their routines, and about how to carry out the attack without getting caught. The more the investigation revealed, the more the investigators realized that they were dealing with something far darker than a random act of violence. Koberger had carefully selected his victims, stalked them, and carried out the murders in a way that suggested he had been studying criminal behavior for years. His knowledge of law enforcement procedures had allowed him to evade detection for as long as he had. But in the end, it was his own arrogance, his belief that he could outsmart everyone, that led to his downfall. After Brian Koberger's arrest, the case moved into the next phase, one marked by both silence and tension. His arrest had been a crucial moment in the investigation, but as any seasoned investigator knows, an arrest doesn't bring closure. It only signals the beginning of the long process of legal proceedings. The quiet town of Moscow was still reeling from the shock of the murders, and now the community was bracing for the impending trial. The investigation, while having successfully connected Koberger to the crime through DNA and surveillance footage, was now focusing on building a solid case. The evidence, while damning, needed to be presented in a way that could withstand the scrutiny of the court. The prosecution's task was clear: prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Koberger was the person who had executed the brutal murders of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan. But the case wasn't as simple as it seemed. At the core of the prosecution's case was the DNA match. Koberger's DNA had been found at the crime scene, linking him directly to the murders. But this evidence, while powerful, needed context. Forensic experts worked meticulously to match the genetic material found on the victims to Koberger's genetic profile. This was a key moment. DNA evidence is often a game changer in criminal investigations, but its power depends on how it's presented and how well it aligns with other pieces of evidence. Alongside the DNA evidence, the prosecution was also preparing to introduce the digital footprints left behind by Koberger. His digital activity had been scrutinized in the days leading up to the murders. Investigators found that Koberger had conducted online searches about his victims, about the layout of their house, and about law enforcement techniques. He had been following the case before he became a suspect. This was a disturbing detail. Koberger wasn't just a killer, he had been tracking his victims for weeks, if not months. The digital forensics painted a chilling picture of a man who had been planning the murders long before the night they occurred. The defense, on the other hand, was preparing for a fight. Koberger's attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the DNA was not definitive proof of his involvement, and that the digital searches could have been part of an academic inquiry, not premeditation for murder. The defense's strategy was to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, to point out the holes and uncertainties in the evidence. But the one thing the defense could not counter was the chilling evidence of Koberger's behavior. He had meticulously planned the murders, carefully studying his victims' movements, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. He had stalked them, likely for weeks, and when the time came, he executed the plan with cold precision. There was no spur-of-the-moment rage, no passionate outburst. Koberger had approached the crime like an academic exercise, cold and methodical. As the trial drew closer, the investigators and the prosecution team spent countless hours preparing for the courtroom battle. Every piece of evidence had to be solidified, every argument sharpened. Koberger's arrest and the subsequent investigation had only been the beginning of a long and complex process that would ultimately decide his fate. One key moment in the trial would be when Koberger's defense team tried to argue that the evidence linking him to the murders was not enough to convict him. They argued that the DNA evidence could have been planted or that it was not definitive enough to prove his guilt. But as the prosecution would soon reveal, the combination of the DNA evidence, the digital forensics, and the surveillance footage created an undeniable case against him. Still, there were those who wondered, how had Koberger been able to maintain such a calm demeanor throughout the investigation? How had he managed to appear so collected, so confident, even as the weight of the evidence began to stack up against him? It was clear that Koberger had been in control, not just of his actions that night, but of the entire investigation. He had been living in the shadows, watching, waiting, until the moment was right. As the days passed and the trial date neared, the question on everyone's mind remained: what drove Brian Koberger to commit such a brutal act? Was it obsession? Was it the culmination of years of planning? Or was it something deeper, something darker that drove him to kill in cold blood? The answers, it seemed, would be revealed in court. The courtroom was a place of controlled chaos. The air was thick with anticipation. Brian Koberger sat quietly, his hands folded neatly in front of him, as the prosecution began to present its case. The small town of Moscow, still grappling with the brutality of the murders, now found itself at the center of a national spectacle. Reporters, attorneys, and families filled the room, waiting for the truth to unfold. The focus was clear: justice for the 4 young victims whose lives had been senselessly taken in the dead of night. The prosecution wasted no time. The first piece of evidence they introduced was the DNA. It was simple yet devastating. DNA samples recovered from the crime scene were a direct match to Koberger's own DNA. The scientific evidence was airtight. There was no reasonable doubt that Koberger had been present at the scene. The prosecution's opening statement made it clear: the DNA wasn't just a coincidence. It was the thread that tied him directly to the murder. As the prosecutor laid out the timeline, the chilling nature of the crime became even clearer. Koberger had been studying the victims, his internet searches, the detailed searches of their routines, the way he had mapped out their movements. It all painted a picture of someone who had been planning for months. His digital footprint was undeniable. Koberger had learned everything about the victims before executing his plan with cold precision. The courtroom's attention then turned to the surveillance footage. It showed Koberger's vehicle, a dark-colored sedan later identified as a Hyundai Elantra, leaving the scene at 4:01 a.m., just after the murders had occurred. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was a critical piece of evidence that painted Koberger's actions in the hours leading up to the killings. But the prosecution knew that digital evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed to establish Koberger's motive. Why did he kill these 4 students? There was no apparent personal connection to any of them. They weren't in a relationship with him, they hadn't crossed him, and they didn't even know him well. It didn't make sense. But as the prosecution continued, they began to uncover unsettling details about Koberger's life. Koberger had been studying criminal justice, a field that gave him an intimate understanding of law enforcement procedures. This knowledge allowed him to plan the murders meticulously, ensuring that there were no signs of forced entry and that the crime would be as difficult to solve as possible. It also allowed him to carefully stage the crime scene, leaving little behind that could lead investigators directly to him. But it was clear, he wasn't just following a script. He was the one writing it. The defense, as expected, pushed back. They argued that there was no direct evidence linking Koberger to the murders. They pointed to the lack of a clear motive and suggested that the DNA found at the scene could have been contaminated or planted. They painted Koberger as an academic, a scholar who had a genuine interest in criminal justice and was simply studying the case as part of his work. The defense tried to suggest that the prosecution's case was based on speculation, not hard facts. But the evidence continued to mount. Every piece of digital data, every forensic analysis, painted a clearer and more disturbing picture of Koberger. The jury was listening carefully, and as the prosecution continued to present their case, it became harder to deny the reality of the situation. Koberger was no longer just a student. He was a calculated, cold-blooded murderer, and every piece of evidence tied him to the murders in ways that left no room for doubt. Then came the chilling testimony from a forensic psychologist, who described Koberger's behavior in detail. The psychologist explained that Koberger exhibited signs of a deeply disturbed individual, a man who had been planning the murders for a long time, and who had executed the crime with clinical precision. The expert described how Koberger's academic background in criminal justice may have given him the tools to commit the crime in a way that would evade detection. As the trial continued, Koberger's demeanor in the courtroom became a subject of discussion. He sat through the proceedings with a stoic expression, offering no outward signs of emotion. He did not flinch when the evidence was presented against him, nor did he show any remorse. His actions seemed to suggest that he had carefully planned for this moment, and that the trial was just another step in his cold, calculated strategy. For the victims' families, the trial was a painful process. Each new detail revealed about the murders was another reminder of the brutal loss they had suffered. Yet there was a sense of justice slowly taking shape as the evidence continued to unfold. For the families, this was more than just a legal battle. It was a search for closure, a desperate need to understand why their loved ones had been taken so violently. The prosecution continued to tighten the noose around Koberger. They presented phone records, social media activity, and surveillance footage, each piece of evidence painting a clearer picture of his premeditated actions. Koberger had not just randomly killed, he had chosen his victims. He had stalked them, and he had executed the murders with the precision of someone who had been planning for months. As the chapter drew to a close, the trial seemed to be nearing its final stages. The evidence against Koberger was overwhelming. He had been caught in the act, and his actions before and after the murders suggested that he had carefully orchestrated the entire event. The question now was not whether he was guilty. It was whether he would be held accountable for his actions. The trial of Brian Koberger had come to its dramatic conclusion. For the families of the victims, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, this moment was the culmination of a painful journey, one marked by grief and uncertainty. The courtroom was packed as the prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments. The evidence against Koberger was clear. DNA matched his, digital forensics linked him to the crime, and surveillance footage placed his car near the scene. Despite the defense's efforts to create doubt, the jury deliberated only briefly. The evidence was overwhelming, and after hours of tense silence, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The families exhaled, their collective relief tempered by the weight of the reality. Koberger's actions had stolen their loved ones, and no conviction could bring them back. As Koberger was led away in handcuffs, his demeanor remained cold and emotionless. He showed no sign of remorse as the courtroom emptied. The families knew justice had been served, but it could not undo the pain they carried. Koberger would face life in prison and the potential for death by lethal injection. But for those left behind, the loss remained irreversible. The verdict brought finality, but it would never fill the void left by the senseless murder of 4 young lives. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered to capture reactions, but the families remained focused on what truly mattered, honoring the memories of their children. The trial had ended, but the struggle for healing would continue. The courtroom doors closed behind Brian Koberger, but the echoes of the trial lingered. The weight of the conviction was heavy, but it was not enough to lift the grief that had settled over the victims' families. The sentencing hearing, a final stage in the legal process, would not bring back the lives that had been lost. Koberger's fate had already been sealed with the guilty verdict, but the question of his punishment remained: life in prison or the death penalty? The families, still reeling from the tragedy, faced the sentencing phase with a mixture of emotion. They were not seeking revenge. What they wanted was justice, something that could help them find a sense of closure. The prosecutor argued strongly for the death penalty, presenting the calculated nature of Koberger's crime and his lack of remorse as justification for the harshest punishment. The defense, on the other hand, urged for life in prison, citing Koberger's lack of a prior criminal record and his academic background. After days of deliberation, the judge rendered a decision. Koberger was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the families of the victims were disappointed that Koberger was not sentenced to death, they found a small sense of peace in the finality of the decision. Koberger would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the case was officially closed in the eyes of the law. But for the families, the legal conclusion was only one part of the story. The real journey began in the aftermath of the trial, when the families were left to pick up the pieces of their lives. The grief of losing 4 young lives in such a brutal and senseless manner was something that could never be fully understood by outsiders. It was a wound that would never fully heal. In the months that followed, the victims' families focused on their healing, supporting each other as they navigated the complexities of grief. They honored their children's memories, keeping their legacies alive through charitable efforts, scholarships, and other initiatives that helped others. The pain was still there, but they had found a way to live with it. The community of Moscow, too, began to rebuild, although it would never be the same. The murders had changed the town forever, but through the collective efforts of the families, the friends, and the local authorities, a sense of healing began to take root. As for Koberger, his life in prison was one of isolation. His academic achievements, once promising, now served as a stark contrast to the reality he faced. He would spend the rest of his days in a cell, his name forever linked to the brutal murders of 4 young people. But for the victims' families, the true justice would lie not in the punishment of Koberger, but in their ability to move forward, to honor their loved ones, and to find peace in a world that had been irrevocably changed by his actions. As we close the chapter on this tragic story, I want to leave you with something to think about. This case reminds us that the world isn't always as safe as it seems, and that darkness can hide in the most unexpected places. But it also shows us the strength of those who endure, the resilience of the victims' families, and the relentless pursuit of justice. We must never forget that justice isn't just about the verdict. It's about the healing that comes after, the lessons learned, and the ways we grow from the trials we face. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think is the most important lesson from this case? How do we protect our communities and support each other in a world where dangers can lurk unseen? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more stories that matter. Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to bringing you the next chapter.